All right, welcome everybody to my trading psychology presentation entitled Acting in Your Own Best Interest. And essentially this is a video presentation that's essentially just a review of a seminar on trading psychology that I gave to a group of 50 traders in Las Vegas back in April. And really, well, actually before I get into what we're going to talk about, I should tell you who's talking to you, who I am. My name is Pop Doc Trader, and also known as Pop Doc, and in the real world my actual name is Andrew Menaker. I am a full-time trader, been trading for many years, and I've been trading the S&P mini contract, primarily that one, for the last 5 years. That's been my bread and butter. I'm also a clinical psychologist. I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and I kind of have a unique background as a psychologist in that I've worked for a major bank, Wells Fargo Bank, for over 10 years, did a lot of consulting work with them, institutional traders. And I've worked with everybody from mutual fund managers, portfolio managers, analysts, wholesale bankers, which are more commonly probably known outside the banking world as large commercial loan officers. Essentially worked with many different people around the psychology of financial risk-taking on an institutional level. And I have to say this is not part of the presentation, but I am actually writing up an article on essentially a lot of the psychological differences, or what basically institutional traders and how it's different for them versus the retail trader, because obviously there's a lot of commonality in terms of trading psychology when you're a trader, whether you're trading with an institution with a large amount of money or you're trading your own money. There are some very big differences, and I'm actually writing up an article on that I'm going to be publishing at some point soon, but that's not part of this presentation. And as you look over my disclaimer, my legal disclaimer, I just wanted to say a couple of things here about that. And although I have a PhD in psychology and I'm a psychologist, I am not functioning here as a psychologist, nor am I functioning here as a trading advisor of any sort. I'm simply in the role of an educator and a consultant. And I do have a very sort of unusual, or some people would say unique, background with my psychology, in that in addition to working as a consultant for over 10 years with major institutional traders, before that time, actually back in the early 90s, I also did a lot of consulting work for some federal agencies, the U.S. Navy and the Defense Department and some other agencies, where I did a lot of work around crisis management and threat assessment. So I also have, and I believe it or not, I believe that there's a lot of commonality between trauma work and threat assessment and crisis management and trading. And at the time I was doing that type of work, that consulting work, I was actually not a trader at all. I was not really involved in the markets. But once I did become involved in the markets, I quickly realized the connection that my previous work experience had, and it was it certainly contributed to my knowledge. So that's something I wanted you to know about as well. And then prior to all this, my very beginning professional life in psychology was really kind of goes back to performance enhancement and sports psychology. I did a lot of research in graduate school around sports psychology and performance enhancement, and that was always my very first interest in the field. And then I kind of went in different directions with it, and now I'm actually back to focusing on performance enhancement. As we get into the video here, into the content, I just want to say a brief thing here about my Camtasia video editing skills. I'm really a beginner at this, so unfortunately I don't have all the bells and whistles for the PowerPoint slides that you're going to see, and the presentation may be a little flat, and I apologize ahead of time. So here we are with the first slide, and as you can see, there's some pretty big waves in the ocean you're looking at. And I'm using this picture as a metaphor for trading. Obviously, people use a lot of different metaphors for trading. Some of the more popular ones are a battle or a war, like The Art of War is a very common book, or people think of themselves as a warrior or as a competitor. There's a lot of different ways to think of trading, and I do think of trading as a form of competition, no doubt. And I also like to think of the ocean as the market as an ocean. And the reason why I like to do that is because it's easy to get swept away by it. The market is really an ocean of emotion, and there are waves of selling, waves of buying. There's the depth of market, our dome. The market it's limitless. It's powerful. We have no idea what lurks under the surface of the ocean, of what lurks under the surface of price. We don't really know what's moving price except buying and selling, but we don't know who's doing what or why they're doing it. So, everyone talks about the market, and they talk about greed and fear, and they talk about emotions and beliefs. And, I like to talk about it really as an ocean of emotion. For me, I've had to do a lot of things to instill discipline in myself as a trader, and I know a lot of people have as well, and especially people I've worked with. And one thing I wanted to ask you, as you're listening to this presentation, are you someone who has used a Post-it note by your computer to kind of remind you to do something or to not do something? I'm going to suggest that if you are not trading up to your level that you want to be trading at, if you're not meeting your goals, and you're using things like Post-it notes and little reminders around your computer, you might need to do something more than rely on a Post-it note. So do you think this person standing here has been acting in their own best interest? Maybe they're basically relying on Post-it notes, or maybe they do have Post-it notes and they've just been ignoring those Post-it notes. I mean, that's what happened to me. Post-it notes were just not enough. For a lot of losing traders, it feels like they're always doing the wrong thing. It feels like if they get out of the trade now and they take their profit, it's just going to keep going further without them, causing them to kind of feel like they left a lot of money on the table. And the other common feeling among losing traders is that once they get in a trade, they immediately assume it's going to be a loser, and they decide to get out really quickly. These are very common situations, very common patterns for traders, and these are situations really where you're letting your emotions overpower you acting in your own best interest. And I'm going to tell you something. It's somewhat of a secret of sorts, but it's not really a secret. It's just something that is not talked about very openly or very often in the trading community, at least not that I've seen very often. And that is this: profitable traders frequently have, and not even frequently, most of the time I will say, almost all the time, have the same set of emotions, the same feelings about leaving money on the table, for example, that a losing trader may have. The difference is that the profitable traders, the professionals, the pros, the ones who are making money, are not letting their emotions interfere with acting in their own best interest. They have these emotions. They've learned how to manage those emotions. They've learned to not allow those emotions to translate into their behavior. And that's really the crux of what we're going to be talking about today. There's a lot of new research, like I mentioned earlier in this video. There's a lot of new research on neuroscience, and they're beginning to show now there's some actual biological reasons why people may take profits too early, why they want to book their profit quickly. I'm not going to get into the details of that. That's really for another presentation. I want to make this presentation more practical. Like I said, there's a lot of content out there. There's a lot of fascinating, interesting neuroscience content, but I'm going to try and make this presentation as practical as possible so you can actually maybe take a few things away from watching this presentation, and hopefully it'll translate into you acting more in your own best interest. I'll tell you a little bit about sort of an example for myself in terms of acting in my own best interest and how managing my own emotions. If I'm in a trade, an ES trade, S&P futures, E-mini futures trade, and let's say I just took my last scale out for maybe a 6-point profit, let's say, and then let's say the market keeps moving in my direction, and let's say it keeps on going pretty significantly, many more points. I have learned to be okay with that. Of course, I'm going to feel like I left money on the table, and of course, there's going to be a part of me that's going to be frustrated that I could have made more money if I stayed in longer. But if I allow those feelings to overwhelm me, then I will end up chasing, getting back in, and getting poor location, and most likely giving back some, most, or all, or maybe even more of the money that I actually made in the previous trade. So learning to be okay, learning to be okay with your emotions, learning to be okay with what is a very, very critical personality trait and I should say, really, it's an emotional management skill that if you're not able to do that, you will have to learn how to do that, because I personally don't believe you will be able to achieve any type of consistent profitability unless you're able to manage your emotions on that kind of level. That's just one example of it, and I'll be talking about other examples as we go down and further into the presentation. So that brings us to the question, basically, what is getting in the way between a trader and consistent profitability? You know, psychology tells us that humans are essentially seeking pleasure and trying to avoid pain, or discomfort is another way of saying pain. And that, I do believe that's the case. And let's put this into practical trader terms, okay? You know, the old cut your losses and let your profits run rule. Everyone's heard that rule, I'd imagine. Unfortunately, that rule is usually reversed by most traders who have difficulty taking small losses because it is painful. Essentially, what's happening what's happening is that avoiding a loss is the kind of the technical term that I use for it in trading psychology is loss aversion, okay? And loss aversion is really just when somebody is postponing exiting a loser because you cannot emotionally handle the loss, okay? Whether this is on a conscious level or an unconscious level. There's so much going on both a conscious and an unconscious level. I mean, essentially our brain is like an iceberg. Just the surface of the iceberg that we can all see is what we're aware of. That's our conscious. And the majority of the iceberg that's under the surface is our unconscious. And that's so much of our brain and so much of our behavior is really driven by our unconscious. I'll give you an example of it for trading. And that's a real easy example that comes to mind right now is an impulse trade. Essentially, an impulse trade is really essentially the behavior or a reaction to unexpressed emotion. What happens is you have emotion going on in your mind, inside you, on an unconscious basis possibly. You might even be aware of it, but you haven't dealt with it. You haven't acknowledged the emotion. And essentially that emotion, as it goes down your arm into your hand through your trigger finger, pardon me, and before you know it, you've clicked the mouse and you find yourself in a trade, usually a trade with very poor location. That is an impulse trade. Everyone's done them at some point in their career, and hopefully it's something that you've learned to minimize, and if you haven't, then most likely there are some emotional components, whether they're conscious or unconscious, within you that need to be dealt with, that need to be looked at, that need to be acknowledged and managed. Otherwise, impulse trades will probably continue for you. You know, psychology has a term called acting out. A lot of therapists use that term, and really what acting out is, essentially it's an impulse trade really for traders, and that's really where you're basically you're instead of expressing the emotion or dealing with the emotion internally, you are essentially behaving the emotion. You're letting the emotion act itself out. And as for a trader, that may not be a good thing. I'm not saying you don't want to be aware of your emotions. You obviously need to be aware of your emotions, and the more aware of your emotions, the better. But you don't want your emotions to be driving your actions as a trader. You need to manage your emotions. You know, part of being human is, like I said earlier, you know, we're typically seeking pleasure, and we're typically trying to avoid pain or discomfort. And avoiding pain or discomfort as traders, you know, that means that we try and avoid taking a loss, often when it's still small. But the reality is that trading involves being wrong sometimes. It's just the nature of the game. And you have to also be okay with the discomfort of being wrong. The reality is that we're not going to escape the discomfort entirely, especially in trading. The real gritty reality here is that you're going to have to learn to be okay with feeling uncomfortable and being wrong. That's really oftentimes a surprise for people in trading, especially newer traders who don't quite understand that. People who have been trading for a long, long time, they understand that. And people who've been trading for a long time but are not trading well, they understand that too, but they haven't actually been been able to internalize that. They understand it on an intellectual level, but they actually have not been able to internalize that concept and have that concept actually change their behavior. You know, emotions, as I defined earlier, are a form of self-communication. And beyond a form of self-communication, emotions also work as perceptual filters. They work as excellent perceptual filters. Our emotions really get in the way of us acting in our own best interest. I can tell you about a lot of different experiments, science experiments, psychology experiments that have proven this to be the case. Like I said earlier, there's a whole field in behavioral finance and neuroeconomics. I have a friend of mine, James Gross, who's a psychologist at Stanford. He runs the undergrad research laboratory down there, and he's done some research that's actually been used in a lot of the behavioral finance literature. And I can tell you for a fact that emotions do distort what we observe. You know, one of the trading psychologists who really talked about this early on was Mark Douglas. He didn't talk about it in these particular terms, in terms of perceptual filters and emotions. That's kind of my phrasing for it. But you know, he talked about the four big fears, right? And the four fears, according to Mark Douglas, the fear of losing money, the fear of missing out, the fear of letting a profit turn into a loss, and the fear of not being right. I mean, those are four ways of kind of dissecting fear. And fear is really the big granddaddy of all the emotions, especially when it comes down to trading. You know, even greed is, in my opinion, is a form of fear. It's really the fear of not having enough. You know, I conducted an experiment last year, or 6 months ago, sometime not too long ago, with some traders. About 30 traders completed a survey that I sent out, and it was about 10 questions. It was a very short survey, and one of the questions, basically what I was trying to get at was, you know, are people more upset when they miss a good opportunity, or are they more upset when they just get stopped out? And before I give you the answer, or before I tell you what the survey responses said, what do you think? Well, it was an interesting set of results. It kind of confirmed my hunch, which is that the power of regret is surprisingly powerful. It is very powerful, and it often has a bigger impact in a trader's mind than one realizes. So basically what I'm saying here is that people showed in the survey that there was that they were a little bit more emotionally upset when they miss an opportunity than when they get stopped out. And that's something that, of course, only about 29 or 30 traders completed the survey. So, of course, we can't draw a huge, significant conclusion. You can't say that that's it's a major research finding. But you know, it is some empirical validation for a theory that I have, in that, you know, everyone talks about fear and greed, and I'm going to throw another one in there and say regret. Regret is equally, I believe, as powerful as fear and greed. I mean, fear obviously is the granddaddy of them all, and that's, everything can kind of be traced back to that. But regret is right up there as well, very, very high on the list, probably at least as high as greed, if not higher. It was interesting. Somewhere recently, I don't remember where it was, where I saw this. I think it was Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's number 2 guy, who wrote an article that I read last year sometime, and he talked about the power of regret in terms of financial decision making, and that's kind of what gave me. Part of what gave me the idea to kind of do the research on it. I mean, I'd experienced regret for myself firsthand, and I've seen it with people that I've worked with, but I had never really seen much talk about it or read much about it in the trading psychology literature before. So I kind of wanted to sort of flush it out myself a little bit more. And this survey that I conducted really, it's showing me that it's probably an area that I want to pursue and do more research in, because it's an area that is not really talked about very much. So let's get back to the focus of acting in our own best interest, and I want to pose a question to you, and this is a question I talked about at the very beginning of the presentation, which is, why is it so difficult for us traders to always and consistently act in our own best interest? And really, I think there's two primary reasons, and each one of these reasons, especially the second one that you see on the slide, can really be there's a lot of different aspects of looking at it. But so the first reason really is the market is a unique environment. Okay, the market is highly ambiguous. It's uncertain. What I mean by uncertain is that there's always uncertainty. That's a better way to put it. You're constantly being barraged with ambiguous data, constantly getting mixed signals. There is always competition. There are market forces out at work that you have no idea what their intention is. There are algorithms, computer bots, everything going on that you don't really have any control over. You have no idea how they're operating, when they're operating, and why they're operating, and what their intention is. And so the market is a highly unique environment. You know, for traders who come to trading as a second or career, or they're doing it in retirement, or they've had they've had a previous career behind them, and if you've had success in a past career, then you know, unfortunately, and you probably know this already at this point if you're one of these people, but prior success in a career has nothing to do with trading. As a matter of fact, it actually may have a negative correlation in that people who have been very successful at a previous profession or career often struggle significantly when it comes to trading. And you know, there's certain careers, unfortunately, that I would have to say that I think people have a little bit more baggage coming into trading with. And so, pardon me if this is you. Don't take it personally. But I think that people who have backgrounds being lawyers, engineers, programmers, those three are the big ones. There's such a need for precision and perfection and logic in those areas, in those careers, that unfortunately, if you're a discretionary day trader, and by the way, the trading that I'm talking about for the most part for a lot of this video presentation is discretionary trading, not systems, automated systems trading. But if you're a discretionary trader, precision and perfection is something you're really not going to experience much. And if you are stuck on being precise, on being perfect, that's going to be a big problem. As a matter of fact, I am going to be doing an entire presentation around how precision and the need for precision and the search for perfection are two of the biggest enemies for a discretionary trader. Now, the other aspect of why it's so difficult to act on our own best interest, besides the market being a unique environment, is that our brain, our mind, is not designed for the market. And you know, there's a lot of biological reasons. We're basically wired with these caveman braves, where essentially what's happening is that we're wired for either a fight, a flight, a fright, or a freeze response. And really, that's what typically happens for most people when they're in a trade. Okay, biologically, the chemicals are going off in their brain, and it's causing them to want to fight, flight, fright, or freeze. And it's a huge problem for a lot of people. You know, what it comes down to for so many people is that people are looking for confidence in their methodology, in their setups. They back test them, and they come up with a positive expectancy. It all looks good on their spreadsheet, on their Excel spreadsheet, or their paper, or wherever they work it out, or maybe they don't even back test, but they just have confidence in the methodology, however that confidence was derived. The issue, though, is that for many people who have a methodology that they're confident in, they're still not making money on a regular basis in the market. And by a regular basis, I don't mean you're necessarily making money every single day, and obviously not every trade is going to be a productive or winning trade. But if you're not able to derive an income from trading, and you have a methodology that you believe in, then there's something going on, and that something going on is most likely inside your mind, not something in the market. Yes, of course, in the last few years there's been a substantial increase in computer trading, and all the algorithms are now on the scene in the last several years more and more, and it definitely has changed price action. It has changed the way the market trades. There's no doubt about that, and it has made things more difficult. But at the same time, there are traders who are making money, discretionary traders who are making money. And so if you are one of the folks who is either struggling because you've never been able to make money at it, or you're still kind of at that stage where you're at a break-even point, or maybe you have been profitable for sustained periods of time, but you're now in a slump, you've given a lot of the money back, and you just can't seem to get back on the horse. Those are all indications that what's going on, and also obviously if you have a good methodology in terms of your trading, your setups, if those are things that describe you, then it's most likely something that's going on with inside your mind. You know, if the answer has anything to do with your mind or your emotions or your discipline, then you need to ask yourself a question. And the question is, what am I going to do to change this? Because I can tell you, searching for better setups, different methodology, different indicators, charting, what have you, all those things are basically a way for people to avoid looking at what's really going on under the hood, taking a look at what's going on inside your own mind. You know, obviously, you do need to find the right trading vehicle for yourself, the right trading instrument, and the right time frame that matches your personality. You know, your level of aggression or lack of aggression, your level of risk tolerance, your account size, all those types of things. You know, you need to find the right type of trading vehicle and the right time frame, obviously, for the right fit. But beyond that, if you do have the right fit and you do have a methodology you believe in, and you're still not making money, then you need to really look at what's going on and why is that an issue. And I can tell you a little bit about myself, my own personal journey. You know, I spent quite a bit of time in that kind of that limbo area of break-even trader, where I'd be up, you know, and then I'd be down, then I'd be up, then I'd be down, and I spent a long time in that phase. I suspect a lot of people do. As a matter of fact, I believe that, you know, as the common statistic that most traders are not successful. You know, there's numbers thrown out there like 90 to 95% of the traders are losing traders, and you know, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but I suspect there's also a very, very, very high percentage of traders who are long-term break-even traders. Very, very common. You know, for myself, what I had to do to kind of break out of that break even. Well, actually, I'm not going to get to that later. I will get to this later, but the way I broke out of it was this. I basically had to, and I'm not saying this is what you have to do. This is what worked for me. This is not a prescription for anybody else. But what I had to do was basically drop all the indicators, and I learned market profile so I could sort of understand the structure of the market, and I learned how to read order flow. You know, I used to read order flow from time and sales when I day traded equities. You know, you look for the block trade and you look for the next print after the block trade. If the print's up, then you know that the block trade was a buy. It used to be really simple many years ago, but ever since the algos would chop up the trades and the iceberg orders and whatnot, things have changed dramatically. So what I've done for myself is, you know, I learned market profile, and now I've also learned how to really truly read order flow, and I use order flow through a time and sales strip, and I also look at it through my Market Delta software, where I use a footprint. And that the Market Delta software, by the way, I'm not promoting that here at all. I happen to know the guys who run that. I know the owner, the founder of the company, Trevor, is a great guy, and that's for me, that's critically important software for me. I don't like indicators at all, but I have to have my Market Delta. I also study the internals, market internals, quite a bit. So for me, I had to learn, create a system or a trading environment for myself that worked. And what works for me is essentially, I kind of look at it as a three-legged stool that I have to sit on as a trader. And one leg is market profile for the structure. And when I say market profile, I'm not a purist when it comes to market profile. I really use volume at price, or I should say volume profiling charts. And I use kind of my own variations of market profile. But the three-legged stool, one leg is market profile and volume profiling. I also will need a second leg on that stool, which is my order flow. And the third leg of my stool are my internals. And I take out one of those legs of my stool, and I'm not going to do very well. But I find if I add something to that stool, a fourth or fifth leg, an indicator or something else or some other information, then it ends up actually, it does take away from my ability to trade well. It becomes too much for me, and I don't do as well. I have found my little niche, I found my instrument, I have found my time frame, and I have found my little three-legged stool that I can sit on and I can make money from the market. So I'm not saying you should, throw away your indicators at all, but I'm just describing to you my own personal journey. I really do think, though, that if you're somebody who's constantly chasing after new indicators or studying new setups because you saw someone else do really well with something and yet you have been struggling, that's a red flag. If you're just running from method to method or setup to setup and nothing seems to be working. Of course, maybe you're still in that part of the journey where you haven't found your instrument or your time frame yet, but if you are just constantly moving from method to method or setup to setup and throwing everything at the wall and nothing's sticking, then I think there's something else going on for you. What I think is going on is that you have to learn to cope with your emotions and circumvent the way your brain normally operates. Okay? I'm going to say that last line again because it's a real big one, and it was something that I understood intellectually for a long time, but it took me a while to really truly internalize it. And I would say the same goes for a lot of other traders, even people who've been trading on the floor for many years who they finally internalized what they had to do to succeed. And what I'm going to say here again is that you have to learn how to circumvent the way your brain normally operates. The way your brain is wired is not going to allow you to be a good trader. You, in a sense, have to, I'm not saying fool your brain, but you have to really burn new neural pathways in your brain. And the way you do that, and I'll talk about that a little bit in this presentation, but that's a whole other set of presentations. But basically, from sort of like the 50,000 foot level view of it, essentially it comes down to, again, learning about your emotions and learning the connection between your behavior and your emotions, and then essentially practicing those behaviors over and over and over in connection with the emotions. And that's there's lots of specific techniques that have been created around that, techniques that other people have developed, techniques that I've developed, and that is something that I do believe that most traders who are struggling with the mental part of trading are going to have to learn how to do at some point. You can learn to do it on your own, whether you get a trading psychology book, and there are some fantastic books out there. You work with a coach, you have a mentor. However it happens for you, usually you're going to need some type of a resource outside yourself to kind of provide you some guidance around it. Again, for me, what I had to do really was learn how to wear a different hat for 6.5 hours out of the day during the trading day. A good analogy that I can use here would be when I've done all my consulting for a large bank, I'll say. Normally I do not wear a suit and tie. So when I'm doing the consulting for the big bank, what I'll do is obviously I put on a suit and a tie and I brush my hair, get in the car, head down to the financial district in downtown San Francisco, and I do my work. And when I come home, I take off that suit and tie. I normally don't wear a suit and tie. What I'm doing here is I'm describing how I step into a unique role, or actually basically wear a different hat in a sense, in order to allow myself to engage in a different type of activity that's different and unique from any other type of activities that I might actually be doing in other areas of my life. And that's really how I look at trading. And for trading, even trading from my own home, when I walk into my home office, it's set up really as my own home office. No one else in my family really comes into my office very often. They know this is my workspace, and it's kind of cordoned off from the rest of the house. When I sit in my trading chair, I essentially, in a psychological way, am putting on a different hat for the next 6.5 hours, and I have agreed with myself internally to operate entirely differently than I would for the rest of my day. I mean, really, the best way to put this is, and I've mentioned this to other people before, and that is, it's going to sound a little crude, but this is the honest truth as far as I'm concerned, and that is, to be profitable, it requires a true contrarian mindset. Everyone talks about, not going with the masses and not being one of the sheeple, and intellectually that's all fine to talk about that. But what it really comes down to is doing this really internalizing it and really, really living it and practicing it and acting it, doing it in your own best interest. And being profitable, again, it requires a true contrarian mindset. It's really almost the complete opposite of the typical everyday mindset that most people operate with. Alright, I put this slide up here because kind of keeping with the metaphor of the ocean, which I began this presentation with, which is one of my favorite metaphors. I also, my background, I grew up in California, and I used to surf a lot. I don't surf anymore, but I surfed quite a bit. And I think surfing is another great metaphor for trading. And so this photograph is actually not a doctored photograph. It's not a photoshopped. It's actually a true photograph. I got it off the web. It's not my photograph. I didn't take it, but that's a real shark in the water with a trader. And the reason I have this slide up here is really because I want to kind of use this as a metaphor for, obviously on the surface level we can look at this picture and say, yes, sharks are swimming in the water. We don't know what's lurking below the surface, right? Of what we can see. All we can see is price. We don't really know what's lurking. Who's pushing price up and who's pushing price down, right? We don't know who the buyers and the sellers are. We might get a little fin that sticks up out of the water. We might get a little sense of it, but that's about all we're going to see. But as a surfer in the water, as a trader in the market, we have to learn how to take care of ourselves and act in our own best interest. There are times to be in the market, in the water, and there are times to not be in the market, not be in the water when it's too dangerous. Well, this next slide is really one of my favorite slides, and actually I should probably do an entire presentation just on this concept alone, the path of least resistance, because it is such a big concept and it's so important for trading, at least in my opinion. So anyways, we often talk about the path of least resistance for the market, right? Price is going to follow the path of least resistance. That's common knowledge among price action traders. And just basic general market knowledge. But I want to ask you a question. What is the path of least resistance for the human mind? So essentially what I'm saying here is that while price follows the path of least resistance, as a trader, we have to be comfortable with following the path of most resistance. In other words, we have to be able to do things that might make us uncomfortable, such as taking a loss, admitting we're wrong. Those are things that cause us resistance internally within our own mind. So we have to be prepared internally to follow the path of most resistance, while price is following the path of least resistance. Not always the case, but I find that to be the case for me, and as well as for many traders that I've worked with in the past. For many losing traders, the path of least resistance is really to avoid responsibility. And avoiding responsibility is very, very easy. It's the path of least resistance. Okay. It's also very easy to get on that path of searching for the Holy Grail. That's also very, very easy. Lots of vendors exist along this path of least resistance, all waiting to sell you something. Again, I want to say it, and I can't say it enough, but the path of least resistance for the trader's mind, not for price, but for the trader's mind, is to avoid responsibility. It's all too easy to avoid responsibility. And responsibility includes understanding and developing how we look at our emotions and how we react and respond to our emotions, and understanding and developing our methodology. Both. That's a big part of the concept of path of least resistance. Most people will not go very far down that path. We try to avoid discomfort or pain, like I mentioned earlier, but it's really impossible to not express our emotions somehow. If we don't identify and express our emotions through words or through a journal or in some way, then those emotions are going to express through our behavior. And that's the impulse trade example that I gave earlier in the presentation. Another common path of least resistance for many people, especially traders facing a difficult situation, is to look outward at the situation. And that's where the trader is blaming others, blaming environmental factors, blaming the market, saying that it's rigged, it's the plunge protection team, or maybe the trader's locked in a scenario where they have a particular opinion on how the market should be behaving based on a particular news event. The path of least resistance is a biggie. It really, really, really is. And blaming, and when you find yourself in that place where you're blaming, when you're pointing the finger outward, that really is the path of least resistance. And I can tell you this for a fact, and in fact, I've seen it empirically validated in a way, not in the world of trading empirically validated, but actually in sports psychology. I did research on this myself over 20 years ago, where I had about close to 100 people, college students who basically went through. I put people through it. Well, I didn't do it myself, but I pre-tested and post-tested students who were going through a physical fitness training program. Basically, I pre-tested them on measures of locus of control, which is essentially whether they believe that what goes on in their life is a result of their own internal actions or whether it's a result of external forces. And I measured them on locus of control and self-concept before and after the physical fitness training. And I also measured an equal number of people who did not go through physical fitness training, and I tested both of these groups at the same time. So one was the experimental group and one was the control group that did not go through the training. Well, at the end of 12 weeks of the 12-week physical fitness training period, lo and behold, the group that did go through the training, the physical fitness training, had an increase in an internal locus of control. They felt more responsible for their own lives than they did before they began the physical fitness training program. The people that were in the control group that never did the physical fitness training, their locus of control was kind of somewhat external to begin with, and it really never changed. And to me, and that was actually, it was a very significant piece of research. I probably should have published it. This was over 20 years ago, and I never did. But to me, that really, it spoke volumes to me. And I tell you, to this day, I'm a firm believer in, if you are able to instill discipline in one area of your life, let's say, for instance, exercise. If you're not someone who's in decent shape and you don't exercise, if you're having discipline problems as a trader, I've often recommended to many people, and it works really well for many people, and it works well for me, is that if you get yourself on a regular exercise routine where you become disciplined with your exercise, you will begin to find that discipline begins to show up in other areas of your life, including your trading. It's very interesting how that can work. Okay, like I said, this whole path of least resistance concept, it's a really big issue, and I'm not going to spend much more time on it because I can easily spend another hour or two talking about it. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here. And the next slide is about responsibility and decisiveness, which are two critical components of discipline. And the path of least resistance for the human mind, it usually involves a lack of self-discipline. With decisiveness, there's really two sides of the decisiveness coin, right? You can always decide to take action, or you can not take any action. And especially as traders, hopefully you know this, but not taking action is a valid decision. Sitting on your hands, whether you're trying to be patient waiting for your setup, or sitting on your hands and being patient riding out a winner, taking no action is, and often can be, a very valid decision. So decisiveness and responsibility are two really big components of self-discipline. Sometimes I even ask people, and I'll suggest that, and I'll ask this to you, and you can answer it for yourself, is, do you believe for yourself as an individual, which area do you think you have more, which is the weaker area for you, responsibility or decisiveness? And that can be very illuminating for you to answer that question for yourself and really take a hard, honest look at yourself. Maybe go back and look at your journal entries. If you keep a journal, it's easier. If you do keep a journal, it's easy to go back and look at it. If you don't keep a journal, it may not be so easy to do that. But looking at what is the bigger issue for you, responsibility or decisiveness, that can be a really good clue as to what direction you need to go in terms of working on your own psychology, your own trading psychology, in terms of developing the proper trading mindset. Backing up here just a little bit, when it comes to the self-discipline and taking action or not taking action, learning patience. I, by nature, probably it would be described, I know my wife would probably describe me this way, as essentially I'm not a patient person. I had to learn to become patient. So as a matter of fact, my wife is quite amazed that I've actually really, in a sense, kind of rewired my brain over the years, especially as a trader. And I think maybe she wishes I was able to do this more outside of the trading world. And I have to a certain degree, but she probably wants me to be even more so. But I'm working on it. Anyway, so I'm getting off track here. What I wanted to share with you is that, something that I discovered for myself, where I learned how to be patient, and that is as a trader from home. Like I mentioned earlier, I have my own home office set up, and it's basically just my workspace and no one else's. And I had to find ways to kind of sit on my hands and wait for the setup. There's a lot of different ways of being a trader, okay? In my personal style, I'm not saying this is the right way by any stretch. There's people who are probably do better than me who have different styles. But for my style, and this works for me, is I find that if I take fewer trades, I tend to have a better P&L at the end of the day, and certainly at the end of the week. And one of the ways I've learned how to take fewer trades is I actually have taught myself how to play guitar while I'm sitting here waiting for my trades. So I've got my trading PC with my 6 screens on one side of the office, and I have a kind of a large, kind of a semi-L-shaped desk, and on the other part of the desk I have my Apple laptop. And on that, I've got a bunch of YouTube videos with a lot of guitar songs that I like. And so I have my acoustic, and I have an electric, but I usually use my acoustic. And I sit here and I learn songs. And I have auditory sound alerts set on my trading PC, which will let me know when price is approaching a level or an area of business that I might want to be interested in and do something with. And so when I hear my alarm go off, I put the guitar down and I turn around and I go to work. I don't do that every day, but there are certainly some days I do that, like on waiting for FOMC minutes to be released, or certain days where we're just, market's moving really slow and it's tempting to get lulled into the chop. And it's very, very important that you have a strategy for yourself to not get pulled into the chop. And for me, it's learning how to play guitar. I'm not very good at playing it because I don't really play with anybody else outside of my home office here pretty much. But I've learned how to play, probably 50 or 60 different songs. And it's pretty fun and pretty enjoyable actually along the way. All right, so getting back to trading. Didn't want to get too sidetracked on there. But so, in my work with traders and in my work with myself as well, it often involves developing an internal structure, or a set of internal resources might be another way to put it, so you can better handle things. And what kinds of things am I talking about? Well, I'm going to list them off for you. And these are things that if you have difficulty with any one of these things, and chances are you do, because we're just humans and no one's perfect, and we're going to have difficulties in some of these areas, but some of these areas are really going to stand out for you, okay? And the ones that do, you're going to want to work on. So these are the areas that I believe you have to develop an internal structure in order to deal with. And those would be, the first one is fear, or the 4 major fears, as Mark Douglas would call them, but I'll just lump them all into fear as the first one. The second one is self-responsibility, which we've talked about earlier, taking responsibility for our emotions as well as our behaviors. The third one is uncertainty, being able to handle uncertainty in the market. The fourth one is imperfection, being able to handle not being perfect. The next one is a lack of precision, similar to imperfection, but it is different. And actually, I'm going to be doing a whole other presentation on just these items alone. The next one is handling loss. Obviously, another very big problem for many people. And the last, but certainly not least, it's probably one of the biggest ones that I continue to struggle with, and I think a lot of people do as well, and that's ambiguity. You know, the market's always throwing us mixed signals, and there's never a clear. I mean, I'm a pure discretionary trader in that I don't have an indicator that gives me like a green or red light and says buy here and sell there. I basically have my areas of business that I have set up, that I have kind of on a piece of paper that I'm looking for, that I have written down, and then I'm looking for how does order flow and how are the internals behaving as price is nearing an area of business that I'm interested in. And so for me, ambiguity, there's always going to be ambiguity. I never get a clear, rarely do I get a clear, like everything says, you know, buy or everything says sell. I have to kind of sort it out in the moment. And if you're not okay with ambiguity as a discretionary trader, you're going to get pushed and pulled and chopped up using, well, I don't want to say using indicators, not that indicators are bad, but you're going to have a difficult time as a discretionary trader if you can't handle fear, self-responsibility, uncertainty, imperfection, lack of precision, loss, and constant ambiguity. And before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to say one more thing about the need for precision and the search for perfection, which I believe are really two significant enemies of confidence, of self-confidence among especially discretionary traders. And the same is true for the world of sports and with athletes. And it's very common for sports psychology consultants, and I've told this as well to people I've worked with, is to talk about the development of process goals versus content goals. And what I'm talking about here is it's often more important to be focusing on your process, which is your behavior, versus a specific number that you're looking for or that you're trying to achieve. You know, some people wonder if trading is like gambling, and I'm not going to get into that discussion. That's sort of a philosophical discussion of sorts, but there's certainly obviously commonalities between the two, no doubt, at the very minimum. You know, for one, with trading, you know, we have to actively participate to begin, and end our participation. And in other words, you know, if you're a screen trader at home, you or on a desk at a firm, basically you have to use your finger to click the mouse to enter the trade, and you have to use your finger to click the mouse to exit the trade, right? You have to actively do something to begin and end. Well, in many gambling games, not all gambling games, but like you know, most gambling games, you have to actively participate to begin. You've got to put your chips out on the table. But the game will usually end itself, most of the games, right? Like the roulette wheel stops turning, or all the cards are dealt. I mean, you know, not all games, like some poker games can go on, but a lot of gambling games have a natural ending. And now there's a key concept here that I want people to understand in terms of trading and gambling, okay? There's a key concept around responsibility. And that is that, you know, it can be called, one could call it the active versus passive loser, okay? Where if you are a gambler, you can be a passive loser and still be fine. A passive loser is somebody who's not going to reach back into their pocket to pull more money out and put it on the table to bet, okay? In trading, what happens is you can get into one trade, and if you're trading a highly leveraged instrument like futures, and if you're a retail trader with a small account, or you know, even if you have a larger account, but if you're trading a highly leveraged instrument and you get into just one trade, and you don't actively end your participation, in other words, if you don't pitch yourself out of a bad trade quickly or in time, you could lose it all, theoretically. So in trading, you have to be an active loser in order to succeed or have any even hope of succeeding. Whereas in many gambling games, you don't have to be an active loser. You can be a passive loser. It doesn't require, in other words, what I'm trying to say is in gambling, you have to do something to keep betting money, to continue to keep losing money. And trading, especially in futures trading, all it takes is one really bad trade to let it go against you, and it could theoretically wipe you out. In a lot of ways, I think that trading actually requires more responsibility than gambling, because it's up to the trader when to exit the game. In a lot of those gambling games, the game is over and you're done, right? You can't gamble anymore unless you reach down into your pocket and create a new bet. But in trading, especially futures or any kind of leveraged instrument, options, what have you, if you don't get out in time, if you're not active, you can really, really do some damage. Okay. A lot of poker players, there's the old saying, they know when to hold them and when to fold them, and the pros know, the professional poker players, they know the probabilities and the statistics of the cards, similar to chess, right? They know all the probabilities, so they know when to hold them and when to fold them. They know what their odds are. By the way, do you guys know why casinos use chips and not actual real money on the tables? Some of you probably do know. But casinos understand that you have to be active to continue to keep playing. They know that you have to keep reaching down into your pocket to get more chips to put on the table, right? You have to be active. And casinos will do anything they can to keep you engaged, keep you interested, and not thinking about losing real money. So they use these little things called chips that are nice and colorful, so you don't really think about that you're actually betting money. I've been in Las Vegas a couple times in the last year doing talks, doing seminars, trading psychology seminars for traders, and I've walked by in the casino. I've walked by the craps table, and something I've noticed is that, and I don't play craps at all. I don't really gamble at all, but something I noticed at the craps table is that, sort of a little side note, a little observation of mine, that people who are hoping for a high number tend to really shake those dice really hard in their hand and slam them down pretty hard. People who want a lower number tend to shake them a little bit less in their hand and just kind of have a nice little light touch when they roll them off onto the table. I have no idea what that means, but I just found it to be a very interesting observation. Keeping on with the trading and gambling, I also want to say this, that our brain goes into an entirely different mode of processing when it's presented with ambiguous data versus, say, a math problem like poker. Poker essentially is a probability math problem as well as a social thing where you're trying to read social cues of the other players around you. Trading, if you're on the screen, if you're not on the floor, there are, the social cues are very different. I will talk about that. I have a slide down here in the deck where I will talk about the social aspect of trading, because I do believe that it's a social activity as much as it is an emotional activity, very much so. And I just want to make one little comment here too, and this is not a dig at automated systems traders. Of course, I have a bias at being a profitable discretionary trader myself, but I think a lot of people, a lot of traders, have get the two following concepts confused. Well, not the two following concepts confused, but they get probabilities and statistics very confused. A lot of people think of the two as the same thing in their mind, and they're very, very different. As a matter of fact, what happens for most people is that they see a statistic, that 63% of the time the market did this when that happened, or when X happens, then Y happens, 48% of the time. Well, people will take that statistic in their mind, and then they turn that statistic into a probability. So they extrapolate that statistic and they project it into a probability. And what I'm going to tell you right now, it's probably controversial, and there's probably people who will disagree with me, but I stand by it, and my P&L stands by it as a discretionary trader, and that is that known just because you know statistics has nothing to do with probabilities. And I'll talk about that here a little bit more when I have another slide up here about probabilities in the market and why it's very, very, very difficult to trade on probabilities in the market. I'm not talking about risk-reward. Obviously, you have to have a good risk-reward ratio when you enter into your trade. And I'm not teaching people how to trade here. I'm just trying to teach people a little bit about having a good trading mindset. But I will talk a little bit more about this concept, certainly in other presentations, because I think it trips a lot of people up. Before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to say one more thing about the connection between statistics and probabilities. Essentially, I'll give you an example. A lot of people will look at market statistics. For example, they may see that when X happened, 60% of the time it's followed by Y. Well, many people will have a tendency to take that 60% statistic and turn it into a probability where in their mind they believe that when X happens, then 6 out of 10 times Y will happen. Well, I'm going to tell you that essentially that's not going to always be the case. And the reason why you cannot connect statistics and extrapolate them into probabilities is simply, especially in the market environment, is because in the market, as in any type of data set, you have to assume, well, basically the assumption is that if all the participants were present when that first statistic occurred, then yes, maybe the probability will be based upon that statistic. But if there are a few market participants that are not present, or a few additional market participants that are present today that were not present during those previous occurrences that contributed to that statistic, then it is really quite a leap of faith to assume that the 60% is going to turn into a 6 out of 10 probability. Kind of getting off track here, but that's a whole other area in terms of the fact there's a lot of research on known statistics extrapolating into probabilities, and that's a whole separate area which I'm not going to get caught in here, go down that rabbit hole, but it's an issue that a lot of traders do get trapped in. Well, here we are. Here's the slide I wanted to get to, talking about probabilities. I'll get to probabilities in a minute or two, but it's really I have it, the whole concept of probabilities in trading in my mind. It's really embedded in the social aspect of trading. So I have the slide up here with some people playing tug of war, and if you noticed, if you look closely, where are they playing tug of war? It's on the beach by the ocean. So there's that ocean metaphor. I'm trying to be consistent here with my presentation. So anyway, I'm going to suggest to people here that trading is a social system. You know, it's emotional, like we talked about, but it's also social. There's lots of different metaphors. You know, we talked about battle, a war, even a boxing match, a competition, surfing, sailing. You know, I like a lot of the ocean metaphors myself. But many of the best metaphors, I think, when it really comes down to where the rubber meets the road, when you're trying to determine sort of on a tactical level, you know, where to get in and where to get out of a trade, you know, I think looking at the social aspect of what's going on in the market is really important. You know, trading is both a social and emotional activity. It's social because essentially, if we decide to get long, then at that very moment we are making an implicit assumption, whether we're conscious of it or not, that when we get long, we are assuming that other people or computers or somebody, some other force is going to come in after us and buy at successively higher prices than what we bought at in order to get our position into a profit. Likewise, if we decide to sell or go short, at that very moment we are making the assumption, it might be unconscious, but we are making the assumption that the moment we get short, that we are assuming that other forces, people, traders, computers, whatnot, are going to come in and sell at successively lower prices than the price that we sold at. That right there is the social aspect of trading. One of the ways that I have learned how to read the market is that I'm looking at, you know, where are the people trapped? Are the trapped longs here? Are the trapped shorts there? Where are these people going to be experiencing pain? Where are they going to want to get out? Where might the stops be? All those lines of thinking, that's a social way of looking at the market, and I think it's a very important part to include in your trading. It's become an increasingly important part for me. I'm always looking at the market socially, looking at it emotionally within myself, trying to manage my emotions. But then when I'm looking at my screen and I'm trying to figure out what's going on, I'm trying to get a sense of the social nature of the market and who's winning, who's losing, who's confident, who's fearful, who's trapped, who's not. And I just want to emphasize that in order to understand the thoughts and feelings of others in the market, it's obviously best if you understand your own first. Even with all the program trading and all the algos and everything else, a good order flow reader, a good tape reader is really reading people, and how people are interacting with the market. When you're watching your time in sales and your order flow, you're looking for the momentum and the rhythm and the speed. You're looking at all those different aspects, subtle aspects of order flow can tell you a lot about the emotion of the market and the participants in the market. For my own trading, I talked about my three-legged stool earlier, and I've talked about sort of emotional management and how trading is a social activity. I just want to add that for me, as a rule, the more one is focused on profits and losses, the more one is focused on P&L and other self-related thoughts, the less focused we are on the patterns playing themselves out in the markets. It's that focus in part that provides us with access to the gut or to our intuition, and that's also another presentation that I will talk about, intuition and how to develop that, and sort of the difference between intuition and just hunches, and sort of learning to know the difference and how to develop a good trader's intuition. That's a whole other topic in and of itself, which I will talk about in another presentation. Actually, I'll talk about it a little bit later in this presentation, I think, towards the final few slides. But one little thing that I do that I'll mention to you, actually it's not a little thing that I do, it's a big thing that I do, and it's not actually designed to help intuition. There are very specific techniques that I use for developing intuition, but this particular technique is not designed necessarily for intuition, but it does help with it. And I use a biofeedback device called an M-Wave, EMWAVE, made by HeartMath, and I know a lot of professional traders, institutional traders use this device, and it's a biofeedback device where you learn how to manage your heart rate through your breath. And when you're able to manage your heart rate and the electromagnetic waves of your heart, the heart rate variability, not just your pulse rate, but the peaks and the distance between the peaks and valleys of the EKG, when you're able to smooth those out, essentially you're at the same time what's going on is your brain is producing more alpha waves, and when your brain is producing more of an alpha state, you're more relaxed, and at the same time you're more aware of your surroundings, and so then you have more of your cognitive mental capabilities are available for you to use as a trader. So, and then once you are really in touch with your potential and all the capabilities you may have upstairs in your brain and your mind, you will begin to start tapping into your intuition. Now that's kind of a broad overview of it, and there are much more specific kind of ways of looking at intuition and developing intuition, and I'm going to talk about those in other presentations, because for me intuition is actually becoming an increasingly important part of my trading, especially especially as the markets have sort of become more volatile recently, and price action has certainly changed, and we're getting bigger moves on a daily basis. I think that a feel for the market, for some people it might be more difficult, but actually for me it's actually, I wouldn't say easier, but I can get a very good clear indication as to whether or not very quickly I want to be in the market in a given time, or it's just a market that's too dangerous and I want to step away from it. And I've learned how to recognize that difference pretty quickly. And then I've also learned how to not just recognize it, but the next step, which is even more important after recognizing it, and that is to do something about it, or in this situation, not do something about it. In other words, actually, just because I recognize it, that's only less than half the battle. You have to also protect yourself and not jump in that water with the shark. And speaking of sharks, here's a slide, and this slide is a Photoshop slide. I didn't Photoshop it. I pulled this off the web as well, but I thought it was a good slide because I think it can illustrate a few different concepts. And of course, don't fight the market and act in your own best interest. And there's a lot of different illustrations here, a lot of metaphors. But one that I wanted to talk about, it may not be readily apparent to you by looking at this picture, but maybe it will down the road after you've looked at it a little while. But it's this. Most people know when to get in the market, right? The entry, or even if you don't know when to get in the market, I should say that the entry into a trade is usually the easy part, right? Yeah, maybe learning the setups has been tricky and it's been hard to kind of learn any methodology, but really getting in the trade is relatively easy, okay? The hard part is your exit, is when to sell, whether it be with a loss or with a profit. And for many people, that can be very, very difficult to sell with a profit because they want more profit. Or it's difficult to sell with a loss because they think it's going to come back, and so on. In other words, you can easily get yourself in the water, but do you know when to get yourself out of the water before it's too late? I mean, you can only fight those forces in the water in the market for so long, and eventually you're going to succumb because the market is much more powerful than you are. Okay, as you look at this slide, I want to ask you a question, and that is, which is more powerful, your imagination or your willpower? Imagination really is related to the subconscious or unconscious mind. And by the way, I'm not going to get caught in academic definitions of unconscious and subconscious and so on. I'm assuming you're going to know what I mean here. I don't want to get, like I said, get caught up in academic details. I want to be as practical as possible here. Imagination is really related to the subconscious mind, and willpower comes from the conscious mind. And that subconscious, what's below the surface, things that we're not aware of, is very, very powerful. As many of us know, the unconscious can be more powerful and often is more powerful than what's in our conscious mind. It's when you find yourself doing things that you didn't know, that you didn't expect that you were going to do. That's your unconscious at work. Another great example, a couple of non-trading examples, would be breathing. You're inhaling and exhaling, which takes quite a bit of muscular, fine muscle coordination within your body, but you're not even aware of doing it. It's all happening in your unconscious. Another example would be driving your car. When you're driving, there's a lot of very minute little actions and eye-hand coordination that has to occur, and for the most part, you're not even aware of it, especially if you're talking on the cell phone or just listening to music, or you're just zoning out as you're driving, and you get from point A to point B, and before you know it, you're there. And that's a good example of you being unconscious while you're driving, or I should say, not being fully aware of what you were doing. So the unconscious mind, 90% potentially of our mind is really at the subconscious level. I want to talk a little bit about a lottery winner. Lottery winners who all of a sudden go from not having a lot of money to having lots of money land in their lap, literally overnight. What happens to these lottery winners? To many of these lottery winners, a few years later, 3, 4, I think maybe by 5 years, from what I've heard from others, a lot of them have lost the majority of the money. Some of them have even gone bankrupt. To me, that's the power of the unconscious. Where most people really end up at their level of comfort that satisfies them at the unconscious level. Okay. I think Ed Seykota says it well too. I think in Market Wizards, in one of the first lines of the interview in that book, and I think he talks about it elsewhere in his Turtle Tribe stuff up in Lake Tahoe. his line is "everyone gets what they want," or something to that effect. I may not have every word correct there, but everyone gets what they want. Essentially, what he's saying is that you better be darn sure that you know what it is you want in your unconscious, because you will get it. And there's a lot of people out there who are trading. They tell themselves that they're trading for money and for profit and for gain, but they might actually be trading for because they're bored, or because they want status, or they want to be right. I mean, there's so many, or it's a reason to feel busy because you don't have another job, or there's a zillion different reasons that people actually have for trading that they're not really aware of. And you have to be very, very, very clear that at least one of those reasons, and one of the bigger reasons, better be to be profitable. And you need to instill that into your unconscious, because on the conscious level, yeah, you want to make money, and that's what you tell yourself, and that's what you tell the people around you, your family and friends. But unless that desire for profit is also at the subconscious level, you won't be making a profit. The subconscious is that powerful. So you have to learn how to, work with the subconscious. And of course, there's a lot of techniques out there, neurolinguistic programming and EFT and affirmations, and I'll talk about some of those at the end. And there's pluses and minuses to a lot of that stuff. And I'll be really honest with you right now and tell you that for a lot of people that I've seen, that I've worked with, and I use some of those techniques myself, but for the most part, most people who have a really significant problem trading, who've never been profitable, or who are in a severe slump, oftentimes you're going to need more than just like an NLP technique to kind of turn you around. It's going to take kind of a full throttle approach on a lot of different dimensions of your life, and I'll talk about what those dimensions are as we get towards the end of the presentation. And well, basically, I'll give you a little preview, actually, because we're going to get right into one of those techniques. And actually, it sounds very simple, but it's a technique that a lot of people don't really fully utilize. And the more you do utilize it, it would be really surprising to me if someone was really utilizing this technique I'm about to talk about and was not at least a break-even trader, if not slightly profitable. It's that powerful of a technique. Okay? And the technique that I'm referring to is, and it sounds very simple, and there's a lot of different ways to do this particular technique. Drum roll. So the technique is observing our self-talk. In other words, being in touch with what it is we are telling ourselves inside of our minds. Sounds very, healy-feely, touchy-feely, therapy-wise, that kind of thing. But let me tell you, that is a very effective way of getting some type of access into your subconscious. It's not going to get you into the deepest, darkest recesses of the unconscious mind. Obviously, there's other ways to do that. But at least when you're sitting in your chair in front of your screen and you're trading, it's going to help you right there in the moment. And I'll talk about some of the ways that I do that down the road. But basically, observing your self-talk is an excellent clue as to what's going on inside of us. So how do we observe our self-talk? Well, I believe one of the best ways to do it is to not just sit there and listen for voices in our head, but is to actually be proactive about it and ask questions. People who are familiar with market profile know the classic 2 market profile questions. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why I love market profile so much. Not because I'm a purist of market profile, and I've read a lot of market profile books, but one of I think probably the things I like most about market profile are the 2 questions that market profile makes you ask. And that first question is, what is the market trying to do? And in my mind, even the more important question, the second one, is how good of a job is it doing? And those are 2 excellent questions to kind of get yourself oriented around market structure. Now, what it comes down to for me, I add a couple more questions. Actually, I add many more questions, but I've got 2 here on the screen. And those are, what does the market want, and how can I align myself with it? So basically what I'm talking about here is there's really, there's the power of questions is critical as a trader. You always should be questioning the market. What is the market trying to do? You should be questioning yourself. What am I trying to do? And really, as you're an observer, because a good trader is a good observer. A good trader is an observer of the market, and a neutral observer of the market, and as neutral as possible of an observer of themselves. So really what it comes down to is that there are really, in a broad sense, two broad categories of questions that you should be asking. And the first category of questions are directed towards the market, and that second category are questions directed towards yourself. And unfortunately, I believe most people forget about the second category of questions directed towards themselves. They're only really focused on questions directed towards the market. Now, if you're already trading well, then you may not need to be necessarily tripping yourself up by asking yourself questions. And I do know people who are like that, who are like, hey, don't mess with me. I'm doing fine, and I don't want to be asking myself questions. I just want to fine-tune this or fine-tune that. I don't want to know what's going on inside me because I don't want to screw it up. Things are going well. Well, hey, if it's going well, that's fine and dandy. But for many people out there, probably for the vast majority, I think that you need to also include questions that are directed towards yourself, not just the market. So something that I do is, actually something I joked earlier in this presentation about using Post-it notes. And well, the confession here for myself is that I do have one Post-it. It's actually not a little Post-it note. It's something else that I have taped kind of near one of my screens, and it's ASK, and it's where it basically stands for assess, still the mind, or silence is the S, and K is know my plan. And now it doesn't have to be in the order of ASK. Usually the S for me comes first, where I might use my M wave, make sure that I'm doing some deep, long, slow, deep breaths, and I'm kind of in a relaxed and alert state of mind. And once I'm kind of silenced my mind, I'll kind of look at all my screens and do sort of an assessment of, what is the market trying to do, how good of a job is it doing, and then I'll refer back to my plan. I'll look at my areas of my levels, areas of business that I might want to be interested in, and so I'll try and do that at least once every 30 minutes, once a bracket for market profile traders. And I think for me, it keeps me kind of on my toes. It keeps me in touch with myself, and it keeps me in touch with the market. I can make trades that turn out to lose money, and that's normal. I just want to learn to avoid the bonehead trades, like I mentioned earlier. Like if I can just eliminate a couple of my worst trades a month, that is usually makes a humongous difference in my account equity. Okay. I can't emphasize that enough. You got to ask yourself questions, not just ask the market. And I'll talk a little bit about this more as we continue. Here are some ideas for questions that you can ask for yourself. Are you looking in the rearview mirror, which is basically, are you looking at your last trade and how well it went or how well it didn't go? Are you locked into a scenario like, oh man, we had a horrible report on such and such, the market should be tanking, why is it going up? Or there's a huge head and shoulders, or whatever it is. Are you locked into a scenario? You should also be asking, are you just trying to get your money back from your last trade? You can also be asking yourself, am I taking out revenge because the market stopped me out? These are different. There's lots of different ones you can add for yourself. These are just some samples of ways you can kind of structure some of the questions that you direct towards yourself, not just towards the market. For me, one of the things that I've found that works very well for me and for people I've worked with is a framework for asking questions is, am I reacting to the market, or am I reacting to my feelings, or is it a both? Continuing on with our acting in our own best interest, and as traders, trading's a stressful game, right? It takes a lot of energy, a lot of mental energy, and actually even a lot of physical energy. And when I talk about energy, I really mean attention. Managing your energy is essentially, as a trader, is really managing your attention to a large degree. There's other ways to look at energy, but that's one way to define it. And so a good question to ask yourself is, what do I have control over, and what is outside of my control? So I've listed here on the slide, you know, this is not a complete comprehensive list by any stretch, but I have things that we do have control over, and then I have things listed that we do not have control over. And of course you can add more things to both sides, to both columns. But if you want to manage your energy well, then what you want to do is focus as much of your attention on the things that you have control over, and pull your focus away from the things that you don't have control over. Okay? For instance, ambiguity, which is at the I have it on the cannot control column. Well, of course, we're never going to be able to figure out what is behind the ambiguity, so why worry about it? Okay? You just have to take it for what it is. Same thing with news events, right? Good, professional traders know that, you're looking for the reaction to the news, right? You're not looking for the news to drive the market in any particular one direction. It's more important to look at how is the reaction to the news. That's the key. On the other side of the what we have control over, I've listed several things there. Most of them are self-explanatory. A couple of them I get questions about from time to time, like the visual field one in particular. People ask about that. And what I mean by that one is essentially, that's where you can decide what you're going to let into your visual field, how much data, how much information you want to look at, how many charts, what you put on your chart, how many screens, all that kind of stuff. You have control over that. And I'm going to tell you, if you have a lot of stuff, a lot of things that are on your screen or screens, and you're not really using them, I would suggest taking them off, because it's really, even if you don't realize it or think about it, it's actually draining some of your energy, because it's taking some of your attention away. Even if you don't think you're consciously attending to those things that you're not seemingly watching, there's a part of your brain that is attending to it, and it is draining some of your mental energy. So I would suggest that you be very, very aware of what you let into your visual field, and be very protective of it, and only let in what you actually use, and leave out everything else. The other really big thing, the really, really big thing here that people have control over, is a predefined risk level. Okay, that obviously goes with like a risk-reward ratio that most traders know about. But this predefined risk level, and what I don't have listed here and what I should, is along with the predefined risk level is the fact that you should accept the risk, right? So you need to define what your risk is going to be before you enter the trade, and you have to accept that before you get in the trade, and you have to continue to accept it while you're in the trade. And that's something you have complete control over. I can't tell you how many traders out there end up getting into a trade, and maybe they think they know where their stop is going to be, and either they put in a hard stop and they pull it, or they're using a mental stop and then they just let it keep going way past it, or they add to the position as it's gone against them. Well, and then they get really upset, and then and rightfully so, they get upset with themselves. Well, what they should really be doing is backing up and looking at, what do they have control over? In the market, there's so many things that we don't have control over. We don't have control over price. We don't have control over the economy. We don't have control over most of the stuff in our environment. But the few things that we do have control over, it's in your best interest if you exercise as much control over the things that are available for you to control as you can. I also want to say that when you manage your energy, it also becomes easier. It's still not easy, but it becomes easier to manage your emotions. And I also just want to add that managing emotions is not the same thing as controlling emotions or doing away with emotions. Managing emotions, to me, what it means is learning to understand and cope with emotions. So you don't end up doing something that's some kind of a bonehead maneuver that was not in your own best interest. That's what managing emotions is all about. It's understanding that connection between the emotion and the behavior. For some, I'll give you a little freebie here, a little gem of wisdom, and that something is this. if you can, and this is something I do a lot of meditation, and this is something I've learned through meditation, and there's probably other ways you can learn this, but for me it was really through meditation is how I learned this. But if you can increase the time or the space or the distance, however you want to think about it, between a feeling or an emotion and the actual reaction to that feeling, if you can increase that space, you give yourself a lot more room to make a good choice that's going to be in your own best interest. Okay, I can do a whole presentation on just that, and I probably will. Actually, I will be, but that's I don't want to go down that pathway too far right now, because it's going to be a very long time talking about that, and I think we've already been going for quite a bit of time as it is, and I want to try and be concise here and get to the end of this deck so we can give you some practical things that you can take with you. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about I think this is the second to last slide. We're almost done. Learning to cope with our emotions is really the way that we improve our discipline. Okay, I mentioned that at the beginning of the presentation. We may not be able to control our emotions, but we can learn to manage them to a degree. And more importantly, we learn how to respond to the emotions, the action, whether we take action or we don't take action. Do you ever notice how on some days you trade really well, and you're not just making money, but you're doing all the right things. Everything just seems to be, you're just in the flow. And on other days you're trading, it's as if it's your first time. Like you feel like a rookie, I think the difference between those types of days is it can be price action in the market, but really it's often your state of mind. In sports, great athletes often talk about being in the zone or being in the flow, and a lot of performing artists will talk about that as well. I've done work in sports psychology in the past, done a lot of research in that area, and I also happen to know some performing artists, musicians, and whatnot. And I've talked with people who've been backstage, for instance, like on a network television program, about to make a live appearance in front of a national audience, and what it's like for them. It's very similar to trading psychology. It's very, very interesting. Anyway, so I don't want to get sidetracked here, but as I was saying, in sports, a lot of great athletes will talk about what it's like to be in the zone, to be in the flow, and they often will describe it as kind of like time stands still. They're not thinking about the previous play. They're just really in the now moment, and they tend to do things kind of automatically without much thinking, right? They're in that place where everything is kind of they're unconscious and they're completely competent, right? The old developmental theory that says that we begin and we are basically unconscious and incompetent, and then we become conscious and incompetent, and then when we kind of turn the corner to profitability is essentially when we are conscious and competent. And then finally, at the very highest level of performance, people who are really in the flow, in the zone, at the elite levels, those are people who are become unconscious and competent. They are in the flow, and they are just doing things automatically. I mean, they've burned those new neural pathways in their brain, and the muscle memory is there, and they just know what to do, and they do it. I don't know who said this, but I think it was a famous baseball coach long ago who said, a full head leads to an empty bat. And there's a book I would suggest you guys read. It's a really short, simple, quick little read. It's called Mind Gym, and MINDGYM, short little book, and it's all about professional athletes and basically how they deal with the mental game, and there's some great descriptions in there about essentially what it's like for them to be in the flow and in the zone, and when they're not in the flow, when they're not in the zone, and how they can tell the difference. By the way, I can tell you this too for a fact. People that I've worked with some sports psychologists who've worked with very, very high level athletes at the Olympic level, and and I also have a friend of mine who works as a consultant for some pro basketball teams. And what happens is that when you have performers, whether they're athletic or they're entertainers, whatever it is, but if somebody's performing at the highest world-class level and you have a group of them doing it together and there's a competition involved, very often what happens is that a lot of these folks are really, the physical skill level is all fairly similar. There might be, a few strengths and weaknesses and some differences in some of the sub areas, but for the most part, the physical skill level is all very, very high. And the reason why one person wins the championship and one person doesn't, and then the following year the other person wins, usually the difference comes down to the mental game. One of the things I like to do, I don't do it that often nowadays because I've been so busy, but one of the things I would do if I were you once in a while is if you're watching a sports a game, these, and I don't mean like a golf game, but more like games where there's points involved, like a baseball, basketball, football game, particularly the basketball or football. You see this a lot. You listen to the coach or the MVP interview after the game, and oftentimes you'll hear something to the effect of how it was defense that won the game, right? And it's a very, very common statement that you'll hear. So for athletes, the big D is defense, right? And for traders, what is the big D? Well, the big D for traders is discipline. And so a good athlete is always playing. Championship athletes, as much as it looks like they're always focusing on the offense, they are really playing a lot of defense, right? A good athlete, a good championship athlete is really focusing on defense. A good, pros, real good traders, they're focusing on risk management. I'll be honest with you folks and tell you this, that, I'm sure some people are going to disagree with me, but hey, that's fine with me. But I believe setups, if you look at setups, money management and risk management and trading psychology, and put them in the order of what's most important to be a successful trader, I'd put setups at the very bottom of the list. Really, if you've got good risk management and good money management, you're gonna do okay. You may not do as great as you could, but if you know how to position size, money manage, and have good risk management, the setups are not meaningless, but setups are then just kind of added frosting on the cake. Hard to believe, I know, but it's very, very true, and I can tell you that on an institutional level, that's even more true, because institutional folks are moving around large amounts of money, and it's hard to get in and out. They have to leg in and leg out. They don't want to disturb the market necessarily, and so what happens for them is it's an entirely different game, and it's really more about risk management. Not so much risk management around, losses is part of risk management, but risk in terms of moving the market and showing your hand, right? So risk management is a huge, huge, huge part of successful trading among true professionals. All right, so, let's stay on the sports analogy here for a little bit. Good athletes, top athletes, even the very best, they still focus on the fundamentals, right? Yeah, there's all kinds of fine-tuning and strategies and tactics, but the fundamentals are always important. And for traders, same thing. In order to get to discipline, in order to get to the big D, I think we have to know our ABCs first before we get to that D. And the A, in this instance, is anatomy, physiology. It's your body. It's your breathing, your heart rate. There's a definite connection between the electromagnetic waves, the heart rate variability, EKG, and what's going on in your brain. Heart and brain, very, very connected. Your posture, nutrition, exercise, sleep. I'm not going to spend time on those things right now, but obviously you need to attend to that A category. Okay, that's one of the fundamentals of being a good trader is attending to the A category. We have the B category, beliefs, okay, a subconscious, unconscious, core issues, psychodynamic, all the different things that are underneath the surface of our conscious awareness that we're not aware of, okay. There's a lot of ways to deal with, I should back up here, there's a lot of ways to deal with, because this is the last slide, there's a lot of ways to deal with the A category, the anatomy or the physiology category. I like to use biofeedback. I have my biofeedback device that I use. Meditation. If I don't get a good night's sleep, I may decide not to trade that day. I also exercise. I live on the West Coast, so I get up very early for my trading day. Ideally, it would be best if I were exercising before the trading day began, but I don't really want to get up at 4 in the morning. So I don't. I end up trading after the close of the market. It's one of the things I do usually right after the close, and it's kind of a way for me to kind of shake off the tension of the day. I have a kind of a little homemade kind of fitness center that I've kind of made for myself here at home, and I hit it hard right after the market closes, and that's kind of one of the ways I kind of I deal with the A category. The beliefs category, the B. There's a lot of things to do there. Some people use affirmations, or they meditate, and they do all kinds of stuff. Actually, I should say affirmations and meditation are also in that C, conscious focus area. But in the beliefs area, actually I'm getting a little bit tired here as we're getting into the end of this presentation. I apologize for the confusion. But in the beliefs category, people do look at the unconscious, and there's a lot of techniques available for that. NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, is one. There's a lot of other similar types of techniques out there. Psychodynamic is a type of therapy that people engage in. Cognitive behavioral therapy. There's a lot of different types of ways you can go after your beliefs and begin to alter your beliefs and implant new beliefs, because that's a big part of your trading as well. And then on the conscious focus is, what are you fully aware of in the moment, and ways to deal with that. Some of the things that I do, like I mentioned, meditation. I don't do a lot of affirmations, and I'll be honest, I've seen people do affirmations, and I'm not trying to be pessimistic about this, but I haven't seen a lot of success around people who utilize a lot of affirmations unless they do other things in addition to just the affirmations. And there are some ideas that I have about how to make affirmations more effective, and I'm not going to go down that road now. It's going to take too long to explain that. But I think for me, one of the most significant things that I've found useful for my own trading, as well as working with other people, is very specific behavior modification techniques like exposure and conditioning and that kind of thing. Athletes will use a lot of mental rehearsal, a lot of visualization. Very, 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 very common. These are just like I said, at the very beginning of this presentation, I'm pretty sure I mentioned that this presentation is really just a very broad overview of trading psychology, and by no means am I touching on all of the important areas of trading psychology, and by no means am I going to even suggest any even close to 10% of what you can do to address it. I mean, we're just barely even scratching the surface here. But really, I believe that what it comes down to as an individual trader is that there's a lot of good techniques out there. There's a lot of books out there. There's a lot of different approaches to trading psychology. And, you take 10 different traders. They try 10 different things. They're trying NLP, they're trying open focus, they're trying EFT, they're trying visualization, they're trying affirmations. They all try, let's say 10 different traders try the same thing. You're going to get 10 different sets of results, really because I think traders come to trading with a unique set of baggage. And you need to find what is going to resonate with you on an individual level. What type of technique in terms of psychology is going to resonate with you in order to really turn you around. Because I do believe to become a successful trader and to maintain being a successful trader, which is equally as difficult and as important. Okay, I can tell you that honestly, that, one of my big things is, here's another confession for me, is that I have periods where I will have, 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks in a row of just amazing profits, and then I can get, or maybe just a week or two of amazing profits on a day trading basis, and then I can get very, very confident. And years ago, what I would do, my pattern, it was just a recurring pattern over and over and over and over. I would just, I'd get my account would swell up really large, and I'd get really confident. Oh, I got this dialed in. I know exactly what to do. And then I'd really push it, max out on my leverage, get too big with my size, and just get very aggressive. And then what would happen? Well, I'd give away a lot of the money very, very quickly, much faster than I earned it. And that is a very psychologically damaging experience to go through. I mean, it's similar on a much smaller scale where you start off the day green, and then or you're in a trade and it's green, and then you let it go against you, and then it becomes red. Well, that's also very psychologically damning. Same kind of thing, but on a smaller scale. The good news really is that there's so much out there that's available in terms of techniques that one can utilize, and I really strongly consider you to, consider exploring some different trading psychology techniques to find the set that works best for you. Learning to act in your own best interest, it takes time, and often involving more than just reading books and doing a few exercises. It's for most people, they're not even aware of the importance of matching the right technique with that will resonate with their own internal issues. Doing internal work, it takes time. It's a process. It's not like, oh, you learn this technique and then all of a sudden you're going to be the great trader that you hoped you were going to be. It doesn't work that way. There's a maintenance process involved. Okay. Takes time, and a lot of people don't understand this. They give up along the way, or they don't commit entirely to the work, or they go about it. This is also very common. They go about it in very inefficient ways. Learning a new profession or taking yourself to the next level of performance, if you've been in this profession for a long time, it takes time for many people. And this is readily apparent in other professions. But somehow for traders in the trading world, most traders want instant gratification, especially the newer ones on the retail end. Institutional traders kind of understand the game a little bit more in that respect. Institutional traders have the advantage of better technology and better access to faster access to better information, and they also get a lot of constant social feedback from their peers and their management. So they have a lot of advantages that retail traders don't have, and so therefore they do have a leg up, obviously, in a lot of ways. But they also have disadvantages too, because there's a certain amount of performance anxiety that goes along with OPM trading that retail traders don't have. Other professions and trading, I think, just so different. Trading is, in my opinion, is probably one of the most unique, if not the most unique profession out there. And unfortunately, traders want instant gratification, and it usually is not. If you find instant gratification, it's not going to sustain itself for a long period of time. Trading is such that there's always going to be give and take, and you have to be ready to roll with the punches. And if you're always looking for constant gratification, you're in for some difficult times. For me, it really comes down to always reminding myself that I have to act in my own best interest. And if I understand my emotions and I understand the connection between my emotions and my behavior, and I do a lot of things for myself, and I've taught a lot of people how to do different things for themselves, in that space between what occurs between the emotion and the actual action that follows it, the behavior, in that space, that is the critical space of trading psychology in my mind. So anyways, I appreciate you sitting through and listening to all this. It's a long presentation, and I hope it was illuminating for people. One last thing here. I'm just kind of looking at my notes, and something I wanted to mention earlier in a slide, and that is, people keep statistics on their trades, and something I'm going to suggest to people, besides just the normal stats of like your win rate, your loss rate, and your average winner versus your average size of your loser, those kinds of things. Here's one that you should think about. And I've suggested this to people over the years, and I've found it very, very illuminating. I know I have for myself as well, and that is you should also keep track of the average time of your losing trade versus the average time of your winners, in terms of, in other words, how long are you holding a loser and how long do you hold your winners for? Start tracking that, and it'll be very, very interesting. Anyway, so that's it for now. Like I said, I just scratched the surface on this presentation, and there will most likely be more to follow. So thank you again. And by the way, all this material is, I do have a copyright on it, and if you want more information, my website is www.publishingmybook.com. popdoctrader.com. And it's not fully live right now as this recording is being made, but the website will be live soon. Thank you.